Have your Bibles, and I hope you do. Turn with me to John chapter 21, and in just a moment we're going to read a section of Scripture there in John 21. You've never messed up as bad as he has. Now, you've messed up. You've made mistakes. You have failed. There are things that shame you. There are things that if they were known by others, you would feel shame from others, an embarrassment that was there. You might hold the facade of perfection at work. You might pretend to have it at home, but that facade breaks down as soon as you enter into those doors, for there are no perfect people in this place, and we know it. But nobody's ever messed up worse than him. Now he had messed up before, Peter. He had messed up. He had actually rebuked Jesus, saying, Jesus, you don't know what you're talking about here. He had misunderstood his teachings. He had had the opportunity to walk on water, but didn't have the faith to hold him there. He was one of the ones that was holding the little children back from Jesus, to which the text says made Jesus indignant. He had made mistakes before, but nothing like this. They had been reclining at the table, what became a quintessential night in the whole ministry of Jesus. And Jesus had washed their feet, and Peter didn't really like it very much, but they worked through it. And then Jesus began to say that one of you is going to betray me. And Peter and John tried to figure out who it was, and Judas was outed, and he left the room. And then Jesus kind of opened up his heart in a deeper way than maybe he had before. And he began to talk about his death, that he was going away, he was going someplace. And Peter thought to himself, where is it that you're going? And why can't we come with you? I'll go anywhere, Peter thought. I'll die for you. And Jesus had warned him. He warned him that before this night is over, Peter, you're going to fail me in a way that you can't even begin to imagine right now, and it's not just going to happen once, but 3 times. Peter thought there's no way. But then it happened. He did something he could never imagine, and it all happened so quickly that before he could even understand what was going on, it didn't just happen once, it happened twice and a third time. And the exact prediction that Jesus had made had now come true, and Peter couldn't believe what he had done. And shame had flooded him. It just doesn't compare. I mean, the other things were bad, but this doesn't compare. Yeah, we didn't have enough faith to walk on water. He got all wet, but at this moment, his relationship with Jesus is now broken. And just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. Jesus died. And now all was lost. And Peter has not only the guilt of failing his friend, but now the inability to make it right, the inability to go back to his friend and to say, I'm sorry, to say, if I had to do it over again, here's what I would have done. Instead, he's going to now have to live with this. But thankfully, Jesus didn't stay dead. He rose again. And in that moment, there was a great celebration now of the kingdom was not all lost. Jesus was not all lost. There was now a hope and a promise that was actually there, but it didn't solve everything for Peter now in this moment, because Peter's wondering, yeah, that's great, the kingdom is there, but I don't have a role in it anymore. My sin is too great. I'm outcasted. I'm lost. And we assume that Peter was there the first time Jesus appeared to the disciples. We don't know that for sure, but we assume he was there. But he was probably, when Jesus walked in, he probably shrunk over into the corner of the room. And he wanted to be right there in the center. He wanted to be just all over Jesus, but his sin probably caused him to shrink back. We don't know, but we assume he was there when Jesus appeared again and confronted Thomas. And you can almost hear the story being written in the mind of Peter that if he has that discussion with Thomas, what is he going to have with me? I mean, Thomas just couldn't necessarily believe the resurrection. I doubted Jesus the man and everything he taught. And you can almost get the sense that night that he goes fishing. That maybe he was just hungry. But that there is a great deal of symbolism in the midst of Peter now returning to his old way of life and failing at it. fishing all night in the darkness with some of the other disciples, and they catch nothing. He used to be able to do this with ease, and now he's given everything up for it, and now he tries to go back to it, and he can't do it. As the dawn begins to come up, Peter doesn't recognize that is also a picture of what's about to happen in his life, that the day is about to begin. There's this shadowy figure on the shore, and cries out, "Hey, have y'all caught anything?" And the disciples say, "No, we haven't caught anything." And he says, "Well, cast your net on the other side." And the disciples are so weary by that point, they're maybe willing to try anything, or they think, we'll show him. If there's no fish on this side, there ain't no fish on that side, and they throw the nets over the other side. They begin to catch the fish. And John's in this boat on the Sea of Tiberias, the same sea where Jesus had walked on water, the same shoreline where Jesus had fed the 5,000, the very same kind of place where Jesus had said, "I am the bread of life." Jesus, who having already done a miraculous catch of the fish before, John in that moment puts it all together. They had seen Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. He wasn't with them all the time, and he says, "Peter, that's the Lord." And you can almost get the sense that in that moment, the day of shrinking in the corner might be over. That Peter he wants it. He wants to come back. He at least wants to know, what is my fate? And so he doesn't wait until they could row the boat ashore. He jumps in and begins to swim. The rest of the disciples bring the boat ashore with all the fish. They get there. Jesus has already started a fire and already cooking some appetizers. Then Jesus says, "Why don't y'all come and have breakfast?" And they once again enjoy this meal, this first meal, maybe all of them together, since what they had had in that upper room. But even that, in the midst of it all, had to cause a twinge of guilt in the life of Peter. A doubt. Where do I stand with him? Am I in or am I out? We'll pick up the rest of the story in John chapter 21. We're going to start reading in verse number 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved because he said it to him a third time. "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you to where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had been reclining at the table close to him, and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" And Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So the saying spread among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, that we know his testimony is true. Now there were also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. One of the reasons I love preaching through a book of the Bible is you begin to pick up the structure of what the gospel writer, what the biblical writer is doing, and you begin to see a meaning and a purpose within the structure. So how many times at this point in a sermon over these last year have I talked about the book of signs and the book of glory and the 7 signs in the first 12 chapters and Jesus' road to the cross and the book of glory. And John, the gospel writer, puts together a masterful argument to prove that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. But there's an aspect to the ending of John's gospel that I find pretty fascinating. We said last week that at the end of chapter 20, it appears as though the book is over. The resurrection has occurred. Everything kind of has been set in place the way it's supposed to. And John ends chapter 20 by saying, here's the reason I've written this book, that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that by believing you might have life. And it comes to this pretty end. But then chapter 21 is added. And at first it seems like a weird addition, but I love its presence there. And ultimately, there's a practical reason that it is there, because the New Testament church is going on by the time the Gospel of John is written, and Peter clearly has become one of its leaders, and his legacy is important. So in part, the Gospel writer is saying, here's why Peter became what he became. But what I love about it more than anything is Peter almost becomes this beautiful illustration of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we would think that what that would mean is that the leader among the disciples never made any mistakes. He did great things. He was the quintessential disciple. Here's who you need to be. But instead, Peter, the seemingly leader of the disciples, did some great things. In chapter 1, we see that he's one of the very first disciples called. That John the Baptist began to proclaim that Jesus is the one, behold, the Lamb of God. And Andrew began to believe, and Andrew went and got Simon, and Simon believed as well. One of the very first disciples. Did so many good things. But then he failed in such dramatic ways. We would have never seen it coming at the beginning of John chapter 1 when the gospel writer says that I'm going to write basically about Jesus, the light of the world. We would never expect that the gospel would end by one of his last acts being to redeem the disciple who's in charge. That instead of John writing this argument and saying, see, here's who you need to be like, instead he basically says, here's who you are already like. You have failed Jesus dramatically. Now, are you going to experience a restoration with him or not? And it's so easy, I think, for us to enter into the emotion of this story. We've all had broken relationships, failed relationships. We've all been in scenarios where there's a rub that is there with somebody that we're supposed to be good with, that maybe at one time we were good with, a friend that we were close to, a family member that we're supposed to be close to, a business associate, a business associate. I've been watching the British Open. A business associate that we're very close to. We've all experienced that idea that relationship is broken. Maybe we have failed in some way. Maybe they have failed in some way. In all likelihood, we've both done things and interpreted them in different ways, and we're blaming one another, and now there's a rub within that relationship. And some people have this tremendous ability to paint on a facade and act like everything is okay. Other people don't have that ability, and you can almost feel the tension. You get the sense from Peter that he doesn't have the ability to act. You can sense the tension that is there. You've been there. You've had that family member maybe that you were close to, that something happened. You didn't like what they did. They didn't like what you did. And maybe words were exchanged. Maybe they weren't exchanged, but words haven't been exchanged for a very long time. And grandma dies. And you go to the funeral, and you know you got to be there, and you know they're going to be there, but the whole time there's that tension that's there. And you watch them when they're not watching you. You're always aware of where they are. You make sure that you just stay clear of them. Maybe you've had that friend. You were so close at one point, inseparable, until that one event. And yet it's a small town, and so you still interact in a small town, but if you see them coming up your grocery aisle, you just make your way the other way. You can get the sense that's what's going on now here with Jesus and Peter. That even though Peter swam to the shore, we don't know what happened. Did he embrace him? Did he get to the edge of the shore and he wanted to go all in, but he didn't know how? And there's that frustration there, and he doesn't know what to do. And the rest of the disciples are then there, and then Peter is pushed off to the side again. We don't know. But here's what I love about this text. Notice who breaks the silence. It's not Peter. Jesus, the righteous one, does not say, well, he sinned against me. If he wants to make this right, this is his job. But instead, the text says that after breakfast was over, so it almost feels like after they had pretended like everything was okay, Jesus, who doesn't do broken relationships, said, Simon, son of John. Well, whoa. He didn't say, hey, Peter, Hey, Pete. Hey, brother. Hey, friend. He says, Kevin Allen. You feel Peter's heart begin to race. Simon, son of John. Right in front of everybody. Right in front of everybody. Well, get out your popcorn. This is about to be fun. We love it, don't we? When somebody else gets in trouble. We love to watch what's going to happen. How's the leader going to handle this? If we were them, what would we do? And then we hope he brings the hammer down on them. We would want grace. They deserve justice. Let's watch. But it seems as though that from that moment on, Peter and Jesus begin to take a walk down the beach. And you can almost sense the disciples going, hey, whoa, come back here. I want to hear this. And John, the gospel writer, researching his gospel, begins to sneak down the beach with them, like hiding in the bushes, eavesdropping in. And Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Very intrigued to know who the these are. Maybe it's the fish. Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than your old way of life? The way you used to do things, what you've just gone back to? Do you love me more than your career? Do you love me more than these fish? These fish that just naturally do what they're supposed to do, that don't have any love within me, but at least they didn't fail me like you failed me. Do you love me more than these disciples? Is your love greater than theirs? Remember that whole debate you wanted to have about who was the greatest in the kingdom? Do you still think you're the best? Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than you love them? It's an interesting question that we have no idea what it means. Do you love me more than these? Peter says, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. But then he goes again, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then tend my lambs. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And the text then says that Peter in that moment was grieved that he asked him a third time. I wonder if Peter got it. The symbolism. It's hard to see symbolism in the moment. It's hard to catch it in the moment. Symbolism is something that a writer uses, a director uses to help the outsider look in and to understand what's going on. It's hard in the middle of what is happening to recognize the irony. Peter, who failed Jesus 3 times, is now being asked 3 times, do you love me? Now, many people try to get into the details here of the nuance of the language, which is why it's translated different ways here, of feed my sheep, of tend my lambs, of feed my lambs. I mean, that nuance that is there, and I think it's important nuance and something that other people can look at, but I'm more of the big picture here. Instead of the nuance of the language, I'm still more intrigued just that Jesus asked him 3 times. Why 3 times? Well, yes, there's a parallelism. Yes, there's a restoration here that he's forgiving each sin here, but I think there's something more than that. I think whenever we ask a question one time, we tend to get trite responses. Remember growing up in Sunday school, and we had great Sunday school teachers. I mean, God love them. Some of you were out here. I mean, you're trying to entertain 4th graders, 5th graders, 6th graders, teach us the gospel all at the same time. And so you'd walk in having this great introduction where you're going to take something ripped from the headlines or from our lives and ask us a question, get a discussion started, how all of it goes, and then eventually lead us in the gospel. And so you come in one day and say, hey, who won the ball game last night? And we're so nervous of getting the answer wrong. We say, Jesus. We're good Baptist boys. We know eventually the answer is going to be Jesus. The first time you ask a question, you get a trite response. And so I don't know if you've ever noticed this on a Sunday morning. I'll ask you, how you doing? I'll ask it 1,000 times this morning. How you doing? But if I were this afternoon to pass you at Walmart or the airport, and I know there's something that's going on in your life, have you ever noticed that I generally do not say, how you doing? You ask me, hey, Kevin, how you doing? Oh, I'm good. I don't follow it up. Why not? Because I don't care? No, I care. Because I don't want you to have to lie. And so if you're in the middle of a heartbreak, I don't want you to have to say, oh, I'm fine. Because that's what you're supposed to say, right? And the first time we ask that question, how you doing, we give a trite response. We give the appropriate response for what society expects. How you doing? I'm fine. But imagine if we're passing in line and I then stop as your pastor, as your friend, and I say, how you doing? A second time. After you said fine, I say, how you doing? Well, in that moment, you're not going to give a trite response. In that moment, it's become very clear, no, I literally have time to have this conversation if you want to. I care about your heart and who you are, what's going on within your life. How are you? Well, in that moment, you don't give a trite response, but in that moment, you may not want to have this conversation. Because if you begin to dive into what's actually going on within your life, the tears might begin to flow, the makeup might begin to run, and that's kind of embarrassing, sir. Thank you for the 8 of you that got that, or at least humored me as though it was somewhat funny. And so what you do in that moment is you give a kind of defensive response. You see, it's gone from surface to defensive, deflective. I don't want to reveal my heart in this moment, so, oh, no, I'm fine. But what if I then stopped and looked you in the eye and said, no, really, how are you? In that moment, we've gone from the surface to defensive to now the true condition of your heart. I think in this moment, Jesus, yes, there's some parallelism that's going on here. He can do that in his sleep. I think the main point in this moment is that Jesus wanted to get to the very heart and soul of the matter. Do you love me? And to make it very clear to Peter, that's the question. That's the question. Do you love me? Because what's the question Peter has been asking? What's the question that Peter had wondered from the very moment he failed for the first time, from the very moment he had let down Jesus, throughout the crucifixion, even after the resurrection, when Jesus was beginning to appear again? What's the question going through Peter's mind? It's not a question of, do you love me? Peter knows that he loves him. He regrets that he has failed. He feels shame and guilt. If there's anything he could go back and undo, it is that very thing. The question, do you love me, is not the question that Peter is asking about himself toward Jesus. It's the question he's wondering about Jesus toward himself. Jesus, do you love me? It's the question that we ask. Do you love me? Knowing everything that I know. Notice what Peter says here. It says he was grieved by it. Grieved that Jesus would even have to ask the question. Grieved of the sorrow over the sin. And notice his response to Jesus. I love his response. He says, Lord, you know everything. You know everything. Well, what all is included in the everything? Lord, you know what happened that night. You know how I failed you. You told me I was going to. I told you no, I wasn't. And you know that I did. You know everything. But you also know, while knowing all of my failures, you also know the true condition of my heart. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And in between the lines, I can almost hear, but I'm wondering, do you love me? But I think Jesus is asking this question to make it abundantly clear that the only thing that separates us from God is not God's love for us. It's whether or not we love him. That we never have to ask the first question. We never have to wonder, God, do you love me? We never have to wonder, God, have we exhausted your grace? Have we gone beyond your forgiveness? We never have to wonder those types of questions because the reality is now set in stone, proven on the cross, validated through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that God's love for us is extreme. It has been lavished upon us in ways that we do not deserve, and there is now nothing that can separate us from that love. You never have to wonder, God, do you still love me? He does. No matter where you've been or what you've done, no matter who you are in this room, it is not any less for any one person in this room than it is anybody else. God's love for you is constant. The question is, do you love him? In the midst of your failure, in the midst of everything that you have done, do you still love him? You know, I face it all the time where talking with people, and maybe it's from a bold, arrogant rebellion that they have run from God. But in other times, it is from an apathetic, overlooked drifting that they've been separated from God. And I'll be in discussion with them, and maybe I know that at one point I know they love Jesus. At one point they were involved in the church. At one point there was a vibrancy to their faith, but now whenever you look at it, it just isn't there anymore. And in talking with them, they will eventually often ask, how do I get back? I want that, almost repeating the words of David in Psalm 51 of how does God restore the joy of my salvation? How do I return to where I once was? How do I have that vibrancy of faith begin? How do I have that relationship with Jesus? And in that moment, I think they're expecting this 5-point plan, almost the same way that we would say, well, if you want to lose 20 pounds, here's what you need to do. There's going to be a lot of suffering and a lot of frustration, and you're going to have to pay for it, and you might lose half. But instead, it becomes very simple. The only thing I think that generally at this point now separates us from a vibrant relationship with God is whether or not, first and foremost, we will own our sin. We have to own it. You see, as long as we don't own it, as long as we're blaming somebody else, as long as we think we've gone through all these jobs because we're so unlucky, we just keep on getting bad bosses. As long as we keep on saying we've gone through all these marriages because we just keep on marrying the wrong people. As long as we keep on saying we're addicted because it's what our parents did. As long as we're blaming somebody else and playing the role of victim and not taking any personal responsibility, then the very offer of God's salvation to us is unnecessary. It doesn't draw us in any way because we don't need saving because it's their fault. And so you have to own it. You have to recognize and own what is yours. What was your decision? What was your responsibility? Yes, other people might have played a role. Yes, you haven't always got exactly what you needed in that moment from those that you love or the community that you wanted. But what is it that you own, and when are you going to take ownership for it? And once you do that, once you recognize your sin, that, by the way, is a grace of God itself. It's something that only God can do for us, to open our eyes to recognize the weight of our own sin. And in that moment, once we feel the weight of our own sin, then suddenly we understand that we have a need. And then once that need is understood, the offer of God's grace is a welcome gift. How is it that we can be restored? How is it that we can come back to God? Well, you have to own your sin. And then you have to receive God's grace. To appreciate it, to allow it to work within your lives. Whenever I think about heaven, I think a good number of people are going to miss heaven because they're never going to be willing to admit that they even had the need of God. They're never going to have their eyes open to the reality of their own failure, of their own sin. And so they will ignore the gospel's invitation because they don't need to be invited. But I think there's a good number of people, and for many people in this room, this is your great threat, our great threat, is that, we can own our sin, but we just can't believe that God could still love us in the midst of it. And notice, so Jesus is asking here, Peter, do you love me? Do you believe that I am who I said I am? Do you believe that my grace that I have proclaimed to you is greater than your sin? Are you willing now to accept it, to receive it into your life? The only question in this moment is not how I feel about you. The only question in this moment is, how do you feel about me? And Peter says, Lord, you know everything. And that is a beautiful confession, by the way. Lord, you know everything. No more hiding, no more facades, no more pretending. You know everything. You know that I love you. And so Jesus, having given him these three kind of commands, then gives him a very simple concept here. He says, then follow me. And he means it. Follow me. And it's interesting that he goes on to say, Peter, whenever you were young, you dressed yourself and you went wherever you wanted to go. But whenever you were older, others are going to dress you and they're going to take you, they're going to lead you to where you do not want to go. And the text says that Jesus said that in order to show the manner by which Peter would die. What Jesus is saying in that moment is, Peter, for the longest time, you've been your own boss. You've done your own thing, for better or for worse. But now that you're being submitted to me, you are going to die for me. Now follow me. And notice the great transformation that takes place here. Before the cross, before the resurrection, before Peter understood this love of Jesus, Peter's greatest fear was death. His greatest fear was suffering, was being associated now with Jesus, so much so that he denied it 3 times. And now Peter's ready to go there. Jesus says, follow me. It's even going to lead to your death. And Peter goes, okay. What's changed here? What's been the transformation in this moment? What is so different from Peter before to Peter now? It's only one thing. Peter now has an understanding of God's love in a way that he did not have before. Jesus had said, after Judas had been kicked out, and around the time he's saying Peter's going to deny him, Jesus had already said, love one another as I have loved you, so you ought to love one another. And the disciples thought to themselves, well, we're doing a good job of that, but then the cross happened and the resurrection happened, and suddenly they understood the depth of God's love. And the next thing you know, Peter begins to go, oh, that's how much he loves me. And notice what that means. That means before understanding God's love, Peter was called to follow Jesus, and he could do it so well in so many ways, but there was a boundary point. There was a line he was not willing to cross. And yet after he got a glimpse of God's love, there were no more boundaries. He would go wherever it is that Jesus called him to go, even to his own death. Now, what I love about Jesus in this moment is it's so like Jesus. That he doesn't generally take away our greatest fears. He leads us through them. Notice he didn't say, oh, Peter, don't worry about that. Oh, I know. Hey, Pete, I know. I know you have a real sticking point here with possibly dying for me. So I'm going to allow you to bypass that. No. He says, Peter, follow me even through that. I don't know what your greatest fear is today, but it's very possible, not promised, and this isn't prophetic in any way, but it's very possible that you're looking for a way of faith around it, whereas God wants you to have a faith through it. You know what strikes me the most in this passage at this moment? You and I will follow Jesus to the extent that we believe his love for us. That's it. To the extent that you honestly believe that God loves you, you'll follow him. So notice what that means. Whenever you and I disobey, whenever we don't follow, whenever we rebel and go our own way, what's happening in that moment is not just a revelation of our own heart toward our actions and poor decision making. It's a revelation that we do not understand God's great love for us. To the extent that you and I believe God loves us, we will obey. And so his command to you and I today, no matter where you've been, if you've run from him or drifted from him or if you stayed right beside him, the challenge in this moment is to follow him. Just follow him. Whatever that means for today. You don't have to start worrying about tomorrow's problems. You don't have to think about what that might mean in the future. Jesus didn't say, hey, Pete, here's exactly how you're about to die. Now follow me. He just said, follow me. And so he says the same to us. And there's a beauty in that simplicity. It means if the treatment isn't going well, follow him. It means if you don't know what this week holds, just every single day, follow him. It means if you don't like the cards you've been dealt, appreciate the fact that you don't like it, but in the midst of it, play the hand and follow him. It means in the midst of total success, you better make sure you follow him. It means in the midst of total failure, if you want to turn things around, just start following him. And Peter, with this beautiful simplicity, just agrees. But he does have one question. John's been sneaking around this whole time, and Peter knows that he's there, and Peter goes, hey, I have one question. What are you going to do with him? So I'm about to be led to places I do not want to go and die. Okay, I can take that, but what are you going to do with him? And notice what Jesus says. It's none of your business. Isn't that great? He says, none of your business. No, but Lord, I'm going to follow you no matter what. Just tell me. No, you don't need to know. Let me deal with him. It's none of your business. I wonder today, who are you worried about? Not worried about in a loving, compassionate, how can I serve them kind of way, but worried about in a, God, are you giving them more than they deserve? Worried about, I want to make sure I get a fair deal. I like the price I paid for this car, unless I found out you paid less. Who is it that you're worried about? You know what Jesus says? None of your business. It is none of your business what God does with your ex-wife. None. But she's getting off scot-free. None of your business. But I'm suffering. None of your business. Follow him. It is none of your business about what God does with that person that deeply hurt you, that deeply offended you. It's none of your business. It's none of your business what God does with your coworkers. You're going up the ladder and suddenly you get laid off. It's none of your business whether or not God allows them to be promoted or not. None of your business. What we have before us is so demanding. The challenge to follow him every single day of our lives, in every situation, in every circumstance. There's so much upon us just to do that. We do not have the time or the brain capacity to be negotiating with God about other people. We can pray for them, we can hope for them, we can do the best by them, but in the end, it is up to God what God does with them. You follow him. You know what strikes me? As John's gospel ends, you have the story of two of his greatest disciples, John and Peter, both who have failed him tremendously, but both now restored, a beautiful picture of what can happen to us. But from this point, their stories that have paralleled so much go different directions. Peter goes on to be instrumental in the early church, and yet very quickly he gets the wrong enemies and he suffers the very fate for which he feared, the very fate Jesus prophesied. Peter is martyred in just a few years. But he doesn't bypass it. He doesn't doubt or deny within it. He has a bold faith in the midst of it, so much so that tradition holds that as the boys of Nero went to crucify Peter, Peter stopped them and said, I cannot die in the same manner as my Lord, and he requests to be crucified upside down. John, he faced persecution as well, difficult situations and circumstances, but he wasn't martyred for his faith. Instead, he was actually in the midst of his persecution sent to an island, and while that was isolating and lonely, while he was on that island, God gave him a revelation that we still talk about today. And chances are that 35 or 36 years after Peter died, John died an old man in Ephesus. Now, if we look at their lives, we think to ourselves, John won, Peter lost. But I can't help but think that if they were on the stage today, they would both say, all we did was follow him, and it was worth it. It was worth it. So wherever you are today, whether you have drifted from God or run from God, or you're still just kind of right there close to him, follow him. And if you do that, you will never regret it. Would you bow your heads in prayer?